Jeffrey Sachs is a world-renowned professor of economics, leader in sustainable development, senior UN advisor, best-selling author, and syndicated columnist whose monthly newspaper column appears in more than 100 countries. Professor Sachs served as the director of the Earth Institute from 2002 to 2016. He was appointed university professor at Columbia University in 2016, and also serves as Kettlet Professor of Sustainable Development and Professor of Health Policy and Management at Columbia University. He is Special Advisor to United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on the Sustainable Development Goals, and previously advised both UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and UN Secretary General Kofi Annan on the Millennium Development Goals. Sachs is co-founder and chief strategist of Millennium Promise Alliance and is director of the Millennium Villages Project. Sachs is also one of the Secretary General's SDG advocates and a commissioner of the ITU UNESCO Broadband Commission for Development. He has authored 6 books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers, and Professor Sachs is widely considered to be one of the world's leading experts on economic development, global macroeconomics, and the fight against poverty. Please welcome Professor Sachs.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you. And you've heard 2 great climate scientists now, so I'm going to talk about the politics a bit of all of this. And let me speak briefly so that we can also have some discussion and Q&A if that's possible. So if I speak too long, stand up and say, shut up! And I will try to be quiet and we can have some discussion. The climate scientists, Peter Kellerman and Adam Sobel, who are wonderful scientists and wonderful colleagues, have told you very straightforwardly, this is serious science, climate change. There's no doubt about the basic mechanisms. There's no doubt about the basic forcings at play. There's no doubt about the reality that we're already in the midst of a very risky and damaging global transformation. I missed the very beginning, so I might repeat what they said, but the best evidence on the temperature record is that if you start, as we do for measurement, at the average temperature at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, or in the middle of the 19th century, almost the same thing, the world average temperature has increased by a little bit more than 1 degree Celsius. Probably on the line of fit, taking out the El Nino cycle, maybe about 1.07 degrees Celsius in 2016 above the pre-industrial detrended line, taking out, or the trend line, I should say, removing the interannual variability. There's been a lot of warming, and there's been a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that have caused that warming. And of the greenhouse gas emissions, which are several kinds of gases that all have the property that they absorb the Earth's infrared radiation, preventing that energy from radiating back into space and thereby warming the planet, the most important of these gases caused by human activity are carbon dioxide, caused overwhelmingly by our energy system and some by deforestation, methane, and nitrous oxide. And they each have their multiple causes, but if you put everything together, the main 2 drivers of the greenhouse gas emissions are our energy system, which globally relies about 80% on coal, oil, and gas, and our agriculture production systems around the world, which in one way or another are implicated in carbon dioxide emissions, in methane emissions, and in nitrous oxide emissions. So fundamentally, if the world's going to get safe, it has to make a transformation to stop emissions in the energy sector and in the agriculture sector. And for both of those, there are a whole suite of technologies. Peter Kellerman, you just heard, works on carbon capture and storage. Renewable energy, wind and solar power is another possibility. Hydroelectric power, another possibility. Geothermal energy, another possibility. Ocean kinetic energy, wave energy, and other kinds of harnessing of ocean power, another possibility. Nuclear power, another possibility. They all have the property that they're not burning fossil fuels, and therefore they could provide energy in a way that doesn't raise the carbon emissions. With agriculture, it's probably a little bit trickier, actually. Some of the answer for agriculture is straightforward, and that's stop cutting down the forests and putting some barriers so that there's no more net deforestation. Another part for agriculture would be to restore degraded lands, to put more carbon in the soils underground and above ground. And then there are many ways that are absolutely needed for more precision agriculture. For example, making sure that the nitrogen that is put in the fertilizer actually reaches the roots of the crops through drip irrigation, for example, and that economizes on both the fertilizer input as well as the water input. It costs more money. Most of these technologies cost a bit more money than the market price of the cheap way of doing it. But paying that extra price is worth it because the damages that will be caused or are already being caused by the way we're doing it now are much, much greater than the incremental price that has to be paid to clean up after ourselves. And so this is the idea of the social cost of carbon. If coal, oil, and gas had to pay their true social cost by adding in a tax, for example, on emissions of CO2, then the markets would see quite clearly, well, it's a little bit more expensive to go to solar or to go to wind, but now that there's that hefty tax that's put on CO2 emissions, it makes sense to move in that direction. It also obviously makes sense to invest through research and development in lowering the costs of these alternative technologies, which have already come down phenomenally over the last 20 years, and there's a lot more cost reduction ahead because we learn. We do R&D. We have experience. We have scale. And that's what's happened to photovoltaics, which have come down by factor 100 roughly in the last 40 years. And there's still a lot more saving to come. So there's nothing too mysterious about this whole issue. There's nothing too hard about it in a certain sense, but we're not doing it. And there are a few reasons why we're not doing it. A couple of the reasons are that these are long-term problems where you have to make investments today for benefits in the future, and we're just not so good at that, as a species, I mean. We have to delay gratification. We have to be able to think ahead. This is obviously well beyond the capacity of the current occupant of the White House. And that's part of the problem, is being able to think ahead. Another problem is that these are global scale problems that require local action everywhere. And that means that there is inherently a cross-border externality, to use the economics jargon, meaning that when we put up our CO2, we damage all the rest of the world, but we don't care so much about the bit we're putting up because the damages for us are only a small fraction of the damage that we're causing everywhere. If global warming was local warming, so what you did in New York City determined New York City's temperature, and what you did in Cleveland determined Cleveland's temperature, and what you did in Beijing determined Beijing's temperature, this problem would solve itself. Because nobody could run for mayor without promising to stop the heat and the warming that's taking place, but this spreads throughout the world, so that's the second factor. But there's a third factor that is the most important of all, and that is that there are a lot of really wealthy people, wealthy because of coal, oil, and gas. And they would lose a lot in this transition, even though the rest of the world will gain phenomenally more. And some of those people who are wealthy from that are okay with that. But then there's some really nasty people. Really nasty people. David and Charles Koch, for example. The Koch brothers. Awful people. Awful, awful people who are wrecking our national politics. They have about $100 billion between the two of them. They have the largest privately owned oil company in the United States. They're phenomenally rich, and congressmen are phenomenally cheap for sale. Because all congressmen care about is getting reelected. And that requires TV ads and radio ads and canvassing and buying data. And so our congressmen are completely corrupted by our system. The Koch brothers say to them, you vote for whatever stupid anti-science thing we say, you say whatever anti-science stupidity we ask you to say, and we will fund you. And if you don't do that, we will run an opponent against you in the next primary. This is very effective. This is an offer our congressmen cannot refuse. And the Koch brothers, I give them a lot of credit in some way. Just the two of them have wrecked US politics. And if you add in some of the other really mean, nasty, lying people, from the Scaife Foundation, from Olin, from some of the other billionaires featured in Jane Mayer's Dark Money book, which I really recommend to you to read to understand American politics, then you'll see what we're up against. So take a guy like Scott Pruitt, please take him. Take him away. The EPA administrator. What a worthless, cynical, corrupt person. He's been on the take of Continental Resources, the big Oklahoma oil company. He'll do whatever they say. They own him. And they've been part of this whole idea of putting people into positions of power. And that's mainly what this is about. Yes, it's a little bit difficult because it's a long-term problem. Yes, it's a little bit difficult because it's got cross-border and that requires global negotiations. But even there, 196 countries signed the Paris Climate Agreement in December 2015. Every country in the United Nations signed. And then comes this president of ours. Says, I don't believe in it. Well, who the hell cares what you believe in? You know nothing. Really? No, come on. We've got to be grown up here. I don't know if he knows nothing, if he's as stupid as he sounds, or if he's just willing to say anything. They're all probably true. But this is serious business for you. And I'm not making a political point. I'm making a real human point. that the stupidity that we hear every day is just corruption of our system. Our Congress has been bought. The political process is aiming for one thing, and that is more tax cuts for the billionaires. They're obsessed with this. I don't know. I did hear a rumor the other day that after you've made your first $5 billion, you probably have enough. I don't really know whether you need the 100th billion. But that's how they act, that they're ready to wreck the planet for this. Okay, it's so stupid, by the way, what they say, so phony. Do not get into the scientific debate with them because it's not about science. It's about money. There are no doubt some people who may be confused on this, but that's not what our politics is about. Our politics is about how much extra profit will the coal, oil, and gas industry squeeze out, and at what threat to the planet. So what should we be doing? What we should be doing is making a transformation in energy and in agriculture to reach zero net emissions of greenhouse gases by around mid-century. Why that date and why that target? Because in order to have some modicum of climate safety, and it's too late to have full safety because already all around the world, countries are being hammered by more extreme storms, by more droughts, by heat waves. We already had last year the die-off of 80% of the Great Barrier Reef of Australia because of the warming of the ocean waters. So we cannot avoid climate damage. But to avoid climate catastrophe, the world's governments agreed on keeping warming well below 2 degrees Celsius. And we're already at about 1.1 degrees Celsius warming. So we have just a little bit to go. And we're on a path for 3-4 degrees Celsius increase by the end of the century, which would be devastating for hundreds of millions of people at least in different parts of the world. It's starting with the dryland places that are so dry that a little bit of warming can be devastating. Places like Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or Somalia or Yemen are already in climate crisis, and they're already in violence and social crisis, in part because of hunger and because of impoverishment and because of environmental threats. And what the climate scientists have told us is that there's a very real chance that even at a ½ degree C warmer than now, and certainly at 2 degrees C warmer than now, 1 degree C warmer than now, reaching 2 degrees C warmer than pre-industrial, there's a chance, a very realistic chance, of a massive rise of the sea level because of the partial disintegration of the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland. The last time Earth was 2 degrees C warmer than pre-industrial, in other words, 1 degree C warmer than now, was the Eemian epoch, 130,000 to 115,000 years ago, and the sea level in that geologic phase was 6 meters higher than now. So we would have to meet on the 6th floor of the building. We'd take the boat into the 3rd floor and then rise in this building. In other words, Manhattan would be devastated. That's what we're playing with when we have this idiotic delay. So what we need to do is to decarbonize. And for that we need plans, because while markets can do some of it and innovation is needed for a lot of it, some of it requires long-term strategies, like where are the power lines going to be so that we are able to bring solar energy, say from Sonora, Mexico, up to the US Southwest, or so that we're able to bring hydroelectric power from upper Quebec down to the US Northeast, or so we're able to bring massive offshore wind energy to the eastern seaboard. These are all absolutely within technological reach, but they require a public-private partnership and a long-term plan and strategy to bring that about. And our cities need to have a long-term strategy to turn to all electric, because we really are going to be driving, all of us, Teslas in the future, or the equivalent, because the internal combustion engine is just going to have to go away also. And by the way, we should put coal, oil, and gas on a pedestal. We can say thank you every day. You made the modern world. You made it possible to have economic growth, but you have earned your retirement. Because we can't go on doing what we did in the past without disaster. So we need good plans, we need carbon tax corrections, we need research and development spending, and we need to get on our way. And governments have agreed to do this, and then along comes Trump. Now, I'll just conclude by saying I don't think he's going to get very far, because it's just idiotic. It's the opposite of what we need. He says, coal, oil, gas, but who's going to put money in that? You want to invest in a coal-fired power plant? Come over, I'll sell you some other deals. These are loser investments. There's no future for them. The coal industry is basically bankrupt and needs to remain bankrupt. And the oil and gas industry needs to know they're going out of business, and that means you, David and Charles. So diversify your wealth and start closing down your business, because we don't need your oil and gas, and we certainly don't need the new exploration, and we don't need the Canadian oil sands. We've got more than enough proved reserves already all over the world. We've got the lowest cost reserves in the Middle East. Let's run them down as we phase out internal combustion, as we phase out the boilers and the furnaces, as we shift from aviation fuel to synthetics or biofuels. Those are the things we need to do. And the technology, the know-how, even the global agreement is within reach. I don't think they'll get very far, because I think he'll be tied up in court. His orders violate the Clean Air Act. They violate the standards of protection that the EPA is to carry out. The corruption of people like Scott Pruitt is so obvious and patent that we shouldn't take these people seriously. We should just tell them to go home to Oklahoma, because we don't want them wrecking our environment. And we should know that when Donald Trump says, Keystone Pipeline, go ahead, if you invest in it, you'll go broke. And it's interesting, just in the last few weeks, Shell sold its holdings of Canadian oil sands. ConocoPhillips sold its holdings of Canadian oil sands. Statoil sold its holdings of Canadian oil sands. Today's news is that Chevron is on the verge of selling its holdings of Canadian oil sands. My closing recommendation to you is don't be on the buy end of those transactions. Thank you.